This is Andy Revkin at Columbia University's Climate School and Earth Institute, the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability. Also writing my blog, I call it, newsletter at revkin.bulletin.com. And I've been focusing off and on in recent years on the sad plight of the vaquita, which has gotten sadder and sadder. The precipitous decline of the species is like no other. A 98% decline in basically a decade under intensifying pressure from fishing for mostly illicit fishing for species that's prized in Asia and China particularly, and also some conventional fishing for a really large shrimp there. There's a new government move that has really freaked out environmental community, focused on conservation biologists, focused on this species. And there's a tangle here of relations, international relations, domestic politics in Mexico. So Vanda Felbab-Brown, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, has written extensively and done extensive field work and on this question of the interlacing of organized crime, and in this case, conservation, or the lack of it. And I thought it would be useful to hear from you just briefly on that. You had a piece that just came out recently too, just in the last few days, on what you see as options for the United States particularly. But maybe start with the question I just asked Barbara Taylor, also from NOAA, a longtime researcher of this species. She insists it's not over. I find it hard to see a path forward for the vaquita. But I can, when she mentioned that there are some calves, that there's 3 or 4 females that are left, and they seem to be healthy and fat, as she said, at least the last time they checked. So it implies, at least theoretically, there's a potential here. But what are the impediments?
Well, thank you, Andy, so much for covering the issue and focusing on it. As you mentioned, the situation is dire. The last time scientists were able to do systematic surveys, the number of the vaquita was around 10. We know that since then, at least one of the adults died. So perhaps the adult population is somewhere around 9. But hopefully there are some calves. But clearly we're looking at a species that can go extinct in a matter of weeks or months, although it might be years before the extinction would be confirmed. And it's sad in very many ways because it's a case of decades of policy failures despite intensive effort to save the species. It's also in many ways an easier environmental conservation problem than very many other conservation problems. And so that makes the critical state and the failures of policy even more painful and dramatic, because if we in conservation could have succeeded somewhere, this should be a case where we could have succeeded. Now, it's not over. Presumably there are still some of the vaquitas left, but we just have gone through really terrible illegal fishing season in the spring, where essentially only very limited enforcement took place. And we will be heading into another extensive illegal fishing season in the fall. And so start preparing for the fall now is crucial. Why are the vaquitas dying? For the viewers who are not familiar. Well, the principal problem is the use of a fishing gear called the gill net, that are essentially gigantic tennis court-like nets that are suspended in the sea. The Vaquita marina, is a porpoise. It's a mammal that needs to breathe air. And those fishing nets are used principally for the fishing of fish, croaker like totoaba, but also very large shrimp that get entangled in those gill nets. Now, the vaquita also gets entangled there and very quickly asphyxiates, essentially runs out of oxygen. Moreover, the species is very shy, and so they're also very prone to stress and dying of heart attack. But the areas where they occur, the area, it's just one single area where they occur, is a very small area. And so although interdiction on the seas tends to be very difficult, whether this is interdiction and patrolling, against drugs or against pirates. In this case, we are talking about such a small, relatively small area, so clearly defined that effective law enforcement should be possible. But it becomes very politically contentious, as very many people who live, very many, I should correct myself, as some people, maybe fishermen operating about 1,000 boats, fish in the area for other species and want to continue using the gill nets that are illegal to be used in that area. And they have become very politically organized and oppose any kind of enforcement, whether that enforcement is conducted by Mexican law enforcement authorities like the SEMAR, the Marines, or by environmental NGOs. The latter, the environmental NGOs, being the principal agents pulling out gill nets out of the water. Now, this friction between the fishers who want to be using gill nets came to a head in December, where fishers opposed the NGOs pulling out the nets. There was an accident, one fisher died, another one was critically injured, and the Mexican government didn't allow the NGOs then to operate. So the first step in having any hope of preserving the vaquita as a species is to get significant enforcement back on the water to start pulling out the gill nets. And there are ways in which the United States can assist Mexico if Mexico and the Mexican government becomes seriously interested in the issue.
And that's where things can get complicated. I saw, I guess it was in March, there was some coverage of how that death, which was in some altercation between fishing boat and Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, not the first time Sea Shepherd has been involved in this kind of tangle, that seemed to propel a lot more pressure on the president, or at least on his administration, to back off a bit. And I don't know if that feels like an accurate cause and effect.
Yes, it is essentially. So what happened in December is that Sea Shepherd was pulling out the nets. The fishers in the boats that are called pangas that they used opposed it. They tried to harass the Sea Shepherd ships. There was a collision, and during the collision, one fisherman was seriously injured and another one died. And that then led to big street protests with the fishers burning law enforcement facilities. This is not the first time this has happened. There have been other attacks in the ports on land when angry fishers have destroyed boats and equipment, buildings of Mexican law enforcement authorities. But it's important to understand the context here, which is that the administration of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has overall been very reluctant to use any kind of lethal force or strong force for a whole variety of law enforcement issues. López Obrador came to power opposing the previous anti-crime, counter-narcotics policies of the administrations of Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto, his two predecessors, and has called for addressing crime principally through socioeconomic means. So allowing youth in Mexico who drop out of school or who don't have access to jobs to find, for example, training programs, and has really moved the emphasis away across the board from law enforcement, to the point where very significant, very serious attacks that in the United States we would see akin to terrorist attacks were essentially not met with an adequate law enforcement response, where Mexican criminal cartels would essentially set a city on siege, like happened about a year and a half ago. Just take over the city, set it on siege, extort the government, blow buildings, set off bombs, and yet the López Obrador administration did not want to authorize a law enforcement response. The president himself has repeatedly praised situations when Mexican military, Mexican National Guard, or local state-level police forces do not respond to violence. They don't respond to lynching of people accused of crime, or even police stations being set on fire. And so the confrontation at Felipe, the anger of the fishers, giving rise to violent actions by the fishers, is all part and parcel of this setting where the president just does not want to authorize much of any kind of lethal force or any kind of law enforcement force per se. And the other important part of the context is, of course, a significant worsening or even collapse of US-Mexican security cooperation during his presidency, and particularly since the fall of 2020. At the time, the United States arrested former Mexican Minister of Defense, Secretary of Defense, Cienfuegos, accusing him of being a patron and member of a very vicious Mexican criminal cartel known as H2. The US held him in custody, wanted to charge him, wanted to prosecute him. It became a huge diplomatic incident with Mexico. Mexico ultimately demanded that Cienfuegos be handed over to Mexico. The US did so. But even after that, the Mexican government authorized the new law. A new law was passed by the Mexican Congress at the instigation of the López Obrador administration that put such severe restriction on US-Mexico security cooperation that it essentially halted it and significantly hampers the security cooperation. So that's another important context. And the third layer to the context is the fact that the López Obrador administration overall has not been very interested in conservation issues. There are many domains in which environmental considerations have been subordinated to economic development preferences of López Obrador. The most prominent of these is the so-called Maya train that cuts through some of the most pristine, or that is supposed to cut through some of the most pristine territories in Mexico, and environmental issues have been not important for him. Many environmental agencies, ministries, government offices have seen dramatic declines and cutting of their budgets by 90%. So there is a lot of weakening of, however, constrained capacity on the part of the government there was before. That's even weaker now. And there is a fourth element to the context, however, that's important to understand. And that is that as a result of the collapsing Vaquita, and as a result of many violations, extensive illegal fishings, and inappropriate, unsustainable fishing practices in Mexico that are not in compliance with US rules, the Mexican fishing industry is now facing very many US sanctions that pertain not just to the upper Gulf of California, the place where the Vaquita Marina operates, but they also apply to all seafood from that area. So the Mexican fishing industry is being hit very hard by US sanctions related to illegal fishing, the use of gill nets, the bycatch of the Vaquita, bycatch of sea turtles, all of which are having a big impact and hopefully have a big negative economic impact on both fishers and the industry. And so hopefully this will stimulate the López Obrador administration to start focusing on the environmental issues and develop some interest in trying to prevent the extinction of the Vaquita.
Wow, when you combine that multidimensional minefield with the urgency of the Vaquita's decline, it really feels tough. But so you're in the piece you did most recently, you did identify kind of a carrot and stick. That somewhere in there, there's a set of levers or carrots and sticks that could make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. So some of the sticks are already being applied. Those are the embargoes, that economic embargoes that Mexico is facing. And those are not actions of the Biden administration executive branch. Those are derived from US laws. So they have a legal force, And the only way to undo those sanctions is if Mexico starts complying with US laws regarding bycatch of the vaquita, bycatch of sea turtles. Now, the United States can help Mexico in moving toward compliance. It can assist in the provision of nets that are safe for the vaquita. There is a whole set of nets, one of which is called suripera. There are certain troll nets that would not harm the vaquita, and that can also be made or are already sea turtle safe. At various times, the Mexican government has tried to encourage fishers to use those nets, but fishers have been very reluctant, partially because they are used to the gill nets, but partially because there has really been no penalty to continuing to use the gill nets, which are illegal in the area. So the carrot of providing and developing new safe gears has never been coupled with any meaningful punitive actions against continuing to using the old illegal gears. So one set of interventions for the US is to help Mexico transition to the use of safe gears. That includes both removing the illegal gill nets and perhaps distributing fines or using other penalties, imposing other penalties on fishers that continue to use the illegal gill nets. The second is to enable boats to go back to removing the gill nets. So to some extent, the SEMAR, the Marines, the Mexican Marines, are removing the gill nets, but there are very few boats, and they remove only a tiny fraction of the amount of gill nets from the Vaquita safe refuge area that the NGOs like Sea Shepherds were removing. Now, one of the Mexican NGOs that's been key in this is called Museo de la Ballena. They only have funding for about 10 days. So getting any funding into the NGO so they can maintain their operations, again, they can resume their operations, is a very simple, very immediate, very urgent step to do. Third, a third element is to enable, to help Mexico in providing, in developing and mounting intelligence-led operations against traffickers, particularly traffickers of the totoaba. So for viewers, the vaquita is not used for any commercial purposes. It simply dies as a bycatch in the nets. The species that fishers are after and on the illegal market is the totoaba, the croaker, the bladder of which, the swim bladder, is being sold to China. But there is a fairly constraint, very limited numbers of traffickers who are well known. These communities are very small communities like Santa Clara and San Felipe. San Felipe is the epicenter. With that, intelligence-led operations can be mounted to disrupt the trafficking and hopefully the extent of poaching. In March, SEMAR mounted one significant intelligence-led operation, arrested several traffickers. There is great potential to uncover the networks, illegal criminal networks that lead to China and that increasingly entail drug trafficking groups, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. Moreover, in recent days, recent weeks, members of the Sinaloa cartel were involved in killing fishers. There is increasing pressure on the fishers to be smuggling or distributing drugs. And apparently, there are reports that the cartel, or at least members of the criminal groups, are forcing fishers to sell both legal and illegal catch to them, and perhaps even paying them in methamphetamines. It's very hard to get a sense of how extensive this issue is, but there is now an opportunity to mobilize the community to resist these organized crime networks, whether illegal fishing, wildlife networks that go to China, or the local ones. So there is more of a political will that can be harnessed, or at least opportunity to build local community support that could be harnessed, and that would provide opportunities for starting cooperation, restarting cooperation between US, Mexico on countering environmental crime, and even starting to rebuild the counter-narcotics cooperation. And finally, US can also assist Mexico in developing training, including human rights trainings and other capacities for non-lethal crowd control. Now, clearly in the US, we have very many issues and concerns with brutality and violence by police. And the US itself is going through significant reckoning of how to make our police forces resort to minimize its resort to lethal force. But nonetheless, the US also has a whole array of tools and knowledge about nonviolent crowd control that could be shared with Mexico, that could be joint learning and cooperation, so that forces like SEMAR that try to counter the Totoaba trafficking don't face the violence from the fishers and then feel they either cannot respond at all or their response results in further casualties.
Well, this has been a really valuable walk through the possibilities. Is there a sense that the Biden administration has this as a priority at this point? I assume the involvement of crime, given that there's so much pressure at the border generally, would make it a priority. But I don't know if you've seen signals.
I would hope that the Biden administration will start focusing on this issue. It's clear that in its in its U.S. relationship, Biden administration relationship with the Mexican government, human migration has dominated the agenda. And clearly, the United States has enormously significant counter-narcotics and anti-crime interest with Mexico. In the United States, last year, over 90,000 people have died from opioid overdose. Most of these overdoses are linked to synthetic opioid known as fentanyl. Very large portion of which is smuggled through Mexico. And so that's a top priority issue for the Biden administration, but one where the López Obrador government has essentially decided to stop cooperating and stop really mounting any effective operations against fentanyl trafficking, or at least very minimal ones. So I would posit that the Vaquita issue is both urgent because the extinction could really take place in a matter of weeks, but it's also an opportunity, almost a low-hanging fruit, of using this opportunity as a mechanism to start rebuilding deeper cooperation, start building trust again, engage in mutual learning, engage in rebuilding assistance both for countering environmental crime and security crime. So rather than thinking about it as a top priority for the Biden administration, which it hasn't been, I would posit that we can think about it as an opportunity to start moving a whole set of US-Mexican security anti-crime cooperation forward after really bad year and bad months. However, I would actually say that the bigger issue here is not so much the US government, it's the recognition in the Mexican government that these are important and appropriate steps. And frankly, there are many fishers and even members of the Mexican government who believe that if the Vaquita goes extinct, that is actually the best outcome, because then they will not have to struggle with enforcement, with the political repercussions. I would suggest that's not the case, because it can take years to prove that the Vaquita has gone extinct. And during those years, US economic sanctions on the seafood industry can remain in place. So even from very pure economic self-interest, this false hope that the extinction of the species will remove the problem should not be entertained.
Well, I hope that awareness is there or can rise there. I know there's certainly within the general Mexican population, there's a lot of pride and interest in the species. It's iconic, and the politics there seem awfully complicated. But thank you so much for helping to clarify some of this, and maybe we'll try to reconnect in the fall or maybe after the spring to see how things have gone. I'll catch up with you and see what the next steps might be and how things have gone. So thank you again for doing this today, Vanda Felbab-Brown at the Brookings Institution, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you.